Welcome to the 27th video in our series of quilts and projects using leftover 2.5-inch strips or jelly rolls. I've been working hard to use up my leftover strips so I can fit them in a smaller storage tub. So before I started the project for this video, I cleaned out my entire tub, pressed all of my strips, and sorted them into color piles. Some of the strips were easy to sort, an obvious color. Others were multicolored, and so then I had to just kind of go with my first instinct on what pile they should go in so I could separate them out into different piles. I ended up with piles of brown, yellow, black, gray, green, purple, and pink, batik fabrics of all different colors, blue, aqua, cream backgrounds, light blue, orange. I have 2 piles of red and white backgrounds, and then not pictured, I have kid prints and scrappy bindings that are all sewn end-to-end multicolors. I spent a couple days pressing everything and organizing, but it was worth it when I got to see the bottom of the green bucket. I think sorting it like this will help me determine the projects I make using these strips in the future. Once they were sorted and pressed, I could easily fold up the piles and put them in a Ziploc bag to keep them together and neat. And all these bags fit nice in a smaller tub that I can see through to get inspiration for future projects. The kid prints and the scrappy bindings are in different containers, but I'm still calling this a win into a smaller bin because these can just sit right on top. The pattern for this video is called Pocket Change from Moda. I've been wanting to make it for a while. Now the decision is, do I make it in pink and purple with white, or do I make it in red, white, and blue? And because I have trouble making up my mind, I just decided to do both of them. All the strips are already cut and ready to sew, so all I have to do is cut the light and the dark fabrics. From the light fabric, cut 4 strips that are 9.5 inches by the width of fabric. This pattern is from Moda and it's called Pocket Change. We'll leave a link in the description below that'll take you right to the pattern. If you make the pattern according to the directions, it will finish at 56 inches by 72 inches. From these 4 strips, cut 16 squares that are 9.5 inches by 9.5 inches. I'm going to use a different technique to make the quarter square triangles for the setting blocks, so do not cut these into triangles at this point, leave them as squares. The pattern called for 1 1/8 of a single fabric, so I picked a white. You could also use scraps to make this part, so you could use a bunch of different white fabrics and have 9.5-inch squares of each of the different background fabrics for your quilt. Once you get done cutting all 16 of your 9.5-inch by 9.5-inch background squares, you're going to want to draw a line on the wrong side of the fabric from corner to corner. I'm just using a regular pencil, but you could also use a friction pen. Later on, you will be cutting on this line, so you don't have to worry about it showing through on your quilt top. From the dark fabric, you need to cut 4 strips that are 9.5 inches by the width of fabric. From these strips, you need to cut 16 squares that are 9.5 inches by 9.5 inches. For this project, you will also need a binding fabric. You need 5/8 of a yard cut into 2.5-inch strips. I made my quilts a little bit larger than the stated size on the pattern, so I would suggest buying 3/4 to 1 yard of fabric for the binding to make sure that you have enough. Now that all my accent fabrics are cut, it's time to sew. Please use 1/4-inch seam allowances. The pattern will tell you to take 32 strips from your jelly roll and cut them on the fold to get 64 2.5-inch by 21-inch strips. First, you'll sew them into sets of 2 to get pairs, and then you'll finally end up with 16 sets of 4 strips. I'm using leftover strips from other projects. I'm going to randomly pick 2 reds and just sew them together. I try to match up the length of the strips, or I just cut down the strips as I go along, so I'm sewing equal parts to each other. And at the end, it won't matter because I'll have a bunch of different pieces that are all different lengths. My goal is to use up the entire bag of red strips. Now I know I'm making way too much and that I'll have a lot of leftover pieces, but I imagine I'll be able to use them in different projects. Now that I have all my sets of 2 sewn together, I'm going to cut them apart and press before I move on to making sets of 4. As I'm cutting apart and ironing these sets of 2, I'm going to sort them by length of strip so that when I go to sew the sets of 4 together, it's a little easier to match them up. Now, if you want to make this quilt but you don't have leftover strips for the project, you could also collect fat quarters and make the project by cutting those into the strips that you need. You would need about 10 fat quarters of different reds to make this one. You could also just use regular quarter yard cuts. You would need around 11. And if you have fat 8s available from your local quilt shop, you could get 20 of those and you'd have just what you need. Once you have all the sets of 2 pressed and sorted into piles, it's time to head back to the sewing machine to make them into sets of 4. When sewing them into sets of 4, the only thing I tried to keep track of was that I wasn't sewing like fabrics to each other. Just make sure that you mix it up really well. I would purposely try to sew bright fabrics next to dull ones, florals next to checks. You just want to make sure that you mix up all the reds really well. On the longer strip sets, I would often sew several of the shorter strip sets to it just to make sure I got a little variety in the sets of 4 that will be cut later. I would also spend a little time cutting some of the pieces to fit the other pieces. So if I had a longer piece, I would cut it into 2 sections so I could sew them to 2 different pieces. Now that I've worked my way through the whole pile, it's time to cut them apart and press. If I haven't mentioned it recently, I love my Blade Saver thread cutter. It has helped me become a more efficient quilter. Press the seam on the wrong sides of these so that all the seams go in one direction. I did not do that for mine, and when I was sewing the pieces together, I learned that it's much easier if all the seams go in one direction. Also, you want to make sure you cut all the pieces apart so that it's just 4 fabrics sewn together. Okay, just to clarify, if I had to do this part over again, I would press from the back side and I would press all my seams so they go in one direction. The pressed strip sets should measure 8.5 inches across. Now it's time to subcut these into 2.5-inch segments. You want to square up one end and then from that end cut your 2.5-inch segments. Cut as many as you can from each strip set. You can cut from the strip sets separately so each strip set gets its own cutting, or you can layer things and cut from multiple strip sets at once. Some of the pieces weren't long enough to get a full strip set out of, so I would trim those pieces to an average length anywhere from 3/4 inch up to 2¼ inch. I put those special little extra pieces in their own pile, and I'll do something fun with them. If you're making this project using a jelly roll, each of your strip sets should be 21 inches long, and you should be able to get at least 8 sections that are 2.5 inches by 8.5 inches from each of the strip sets. For the pattern as written, you will need 128 segments. I ended up with a really nice pile of 2.5-inch sections and then a smaller pile of pieces that weren't 2.5 inches wide that were 4 across, and then an even smaller pile of pieces that weren't 4 across but were still usable. So out of that big bag of strips, this is all that's going to be going in the fabric recycling bag. Once all your segments are cut, it's time to head back to the sewing machine. Mix and match the segments to make sets of 2. With the right sides together and using 1/4-inch seam allowances, send the pieces through the machine. Make sure that the seams on top point to the machine and the seams on the bottom point away from the machine. You want to make sure you send all of the pieces through the same exact way. If you're careful enough to sew all of the sets of 2 together the same exact way, when you go to sew the sets of 4 together, it'll be a lot easier. If you're sewing with a jelly roll, you will make 64 sets of 2. I'm just going to keep sewing until all of these pieces are gone. It must have been my lucky day because I ended up with an even number of pieces. Once you're done sewing, cut them apart and then head to the ironing board to press. You can press the seam to one side, or if you prefer, you can press the seam open. When I pressed my strip sets the first time around, I had not pressed the seams all in one direction. So as I'm pressing these pieces, I am having to repress some of the seams in one direction so they'll lay flat. You should have 64 sets of 2 to press. And the lines that you're about to see on your screen are from my phone, not your phone. So hopefully I'll get this figured out so that you don't see lines like this in the future. And now it's back to the machine to make these sets of 2 into sets of 4. Now that I have my pieces all pressed correctly, these seams will nest together. For the quilt top as written, you will need to make 32 blocks. Once pressed, those blocks will measure 8.5 inches by 8.5 inches. You can press the seams to one side, or if you prefer, you can press the seams open. If you're enjoying our video, we hope you'll give us a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel. We will have plenty more videos in the future using 2.5-inch strips or jelly rolls. Now that the strip set blocks are done, it's time to work on the 1/4 square triangle blocks. You will need all of the light and dark squares that are 9.5 inches by 9.5 inches. Place a light square right sides together with a dark square. Make sure the light square is on top. Sew a 1/4 inch away from the center line on both sides of the line. I will do one side first on each of the sets, and then I'll cut them apart and then go back and do the other side of the line on all of the sets. The second side goes a little bit faster because you're not having to line everything up. Once you've sewn on both sides of the line, it's time to cut them apart. You can either use the scissors or you can use your rotary cutter. All you need to do is cut right on that line that you previously drew. Once they're all cut, it's time to press. For all of these squares, you want to press to the darker fabric. I usually have that on top so it's easier to pick up. I usually press the seam flat first and then I press to dark fabric. I'm going to press 2 at a time and then I'll turn one right sides together with the other one so that they're all set up for the next sewing session. On the top one, you want to draw a line corner to corner across that center line that you sewed. You're going to be on both light and dark fabric. You can use a pencil or a friction pen. You want to make sure that center seam is nested and then sew a 1/4 inch away from that center line on both sides of the line. Always double check that you're sewing a light fabric to a dark fabric. Once you've sewn them all together and cut them apart, it's time to head to the rotary cutting station. Cut corner to corner on the line that you drew. You will now have 32 1/4 square triangle blocks. You will only use 31 of them in the quilt. You can press the seam to one side, or if you prefer, you can press it from the back side and press the seam open. Once pressed, it's time to trim each of these blocks to 8.5 inches by 8.5 inches. A square ruler will make a big difference when squaring up these pieces. You put the diagonal line right on the seam and then make sure that each of the points are at the 8.5 inch mark. You want to line it up and then trim 2 sides, turn the block around and then trim the final 2 sides. The center of the block should be right at the 4.25 inch mark on the ruler. Now it's time to start sewing our strip set blocks to our 1/4 square triangle blocks. You will put together 9 rows that alternate the strip set blocks with the 1/4 square triangle blocks. Start by sewing 16 of the strip set blocks to the light triangle of the 1/4 square triangle blocks. And then you will sew 15 of the strip set blocks to the dark triangle of the 1/4 square triangle blocks. Now it's time to lay out your quilt and sew the rows together. You will have 5 rows where the strip set blocks touch dark triangles and have a strip set on each end. You will have 4 rows where the strip sets touch the light triangles and have a 1/4 square triangle block on each end. Here are my rows all laid out. I had not yet noticed that I had sewn half the blocks wrong, so all of my 1/4 square triangle blocks are touching the strip set blocks on the dark triangle. I was so busy admiring how pretty it was, I didn't notice my mistake quite yet. And I had so many strip set blocks left over that I thought, I wonder if I could just put a border all the way around of the strip set blocks. The only problem was that I was 4 blocks short to be able to do that. That's when being a fabric saver came in handy, because I pulled out my box of 2.5 inch red squares and just made 4 more blocks. I pieced them individually and then spread them around the quilt a little bit because they seemed a little brighter than the other blocks in my quilt. So I finished up the rows and then sewed all my rows together to get the quilt top. It was right about then that I discovered my mistake. And that's when I decided I didn't care. I wasn't going to rip all of that out and redo it, so I just left it as is. No one who sees or uses the quilt will know that I made a mistake when I was piecing it. I just have to remember not to tell them I made a mistake. I quilted it on my long arm quilting machine. I used a red thread and a stipple and stars design. I used warm and natural for the batting, and then when I put the binding on, I just picked a red from the wall so it has one fabric all the way around because I didn't have any scraps left over to make a scrappy binding. The finished size of this quilt is 72 inches by 88 inches. For the backing, I picked a 108-inch patriotic print, and I love that the binding matches the red on the backing perfectly. Even with the small mistake that I made, I'm very happy with the way this quilt turned out. But keep watching, there's another version coming up. I'm going to do one with the pink and purple fabrics. For this version, I always sewed a pink strip to a purple strip. I wanted the strip set blocks to have more of a checkerboard effect. I used up every piece of fabric that was in my pink and purple bag. I was really proud that most of the time I had enough to get a pink and a purple, although there were a few times when I sewed a purple to a purple just because I had those left. There was a lot more color variation in these strip sets just because there were so many other colors on the pink backgrounds. When I pressed the fabrics for this version, I always press towards the purple fabric. I think this pattern would look good in a variety of color combinations. On the pattern itself that you print, it shows a red, white, and blue version, a pink version, and then kind of a Christmas colorway, and it looks good in every combination. I think it would also be fun to make it a two-color quilt, like just blue and white, or red and white, or black and white. In the pattern, they've included a coloring sheet so that you can test out different color combinations of your own to find out what you want to proceed with to make a full quilt. You could also play around with the quarter square triangle blocks. Instead of making them just two colors with a light and a dark, you could turn them into 4 different colors or even match the pieces that are in the strip set blocks to make little bands of color. So have a little fun playing with the coloring page and making something that's a little different than what you see on the pattern. Let us know in the comment section below what kind of colorway you'd like to work with when making this quilt. We love reading your comments and hearing from you, and you never know when your idea might be the one that sparks an idea for someone else. When sewing the strip sets together for this version, I always had to make sure I was sewing a pink fabric to a purple fabric. As you lead the fabric into the machine, always make sure you start with the same color, so I always made sure that I had pink going through the machine first. And because I always pressed to the purple fabric, if I had seams that were going the same direction, I knew I had a piece turned the wrong way, and I just had to flip it the other direction. When pressing your sets of 2 or your sets of 4, you can either press to one side or you can press the seams open. When sewing the sets of 4 to a quarter square triangle block, there's no seams to match, so that makes it a little bit easier. I had a lot more pink and purple fabric than I thought I did, so when I put these blocks together, I ended up with way more blocks than even the red version had. When cutting the lights and darks for these larger squares, I did use just one fabric for the light and one fabric from the dark. But if you have scraps of fabric that you want to use up, as long as they're a 9.5-inch square, you could totally make this scrappy. I was already making 2 quilts for this video, but if I was to make a third, I would really change up the quarter square triangle blocks of the quilt. I'd make them all different colors and have a little fun with it. The pattern directions have you actually cut triangles and then sew triangles together to make the quarter square triangle units. But once you cut those triangles, those are all on bias edges, so they're a little easier to pull out of shape as you're sewing. I find that this method works best for me. I get a nicer triangle and my seams aren't pulled out of shape. But if you do want to follow the pattern directions and cut triangles instead of using this method, make sure as you're sewing that you're not stretching those bias edges and pulling the triangles out of shape. The nice part about the quarter square triangle blocks is when you're done sewing and pressing, you do get to square them up. And so that way, if they're off just a little bit, you don't have to worry because you make them perfect in the end. After making my mistake on the red, white, and blue version, I paid a lot more attention when I was putting the rows together for the pink and purple version. On the pink and purple version I made, you see more of the star points that go around certain of the strip set blocks and the illusion of the squares around the blocks in both light and the dark. I did double check myself many times on this version to make sure I got it right according to the pattern directions. I had to use my seam ripper a couple times, but that's okay because I caught it early. And I had more than enough blocks left over of the strip set blocks that I could go all the way around the quilt again. I am so happy with the way this one turned out. I did quilt it on my long arm quilting machine. I did a bigger loop kind of design so it kind of added a little softness to it. I used a soft pink color for the quilting thread. It blends into most of the pinks. It's barely visible on the purple. And on the white you just see it a little, but I thought it was the perfect balance to quilt this quilt. And because I got the pattern right this time, you see the squares on point in light and dark, and sometimes how it makes star points around the strip set blocks. I had enough of the strip set blocks left over that I could help make the back big enough with regular yardage by piecing that into the center. I was able to use 5 yards for the backing instead of needing 6 by using those leftover pieces. Again, I had used up all my pinks and purples to piece the blocks, so I didn't have anything left over for binding. So I picked the same dark fabric that I had used in the center to make the quarter square triangle blocks. The dark purple on the outer edge finishes it off perfectly, and it was nice to have one piece of fabric that kind of ties everything together. It was a lot of work to make 2 quilts for this video, but when you can't decide which colorway to go with, that's what you have to do. And here's what I made with the leftovers of the segment cuts. These weren't 2.5-inch wide, so I couldn't use them in the quilt top, but they are perfect for this. I started with 2 big bags of fabric scraps and ended up with this. I had quite a few quilts to bind last month, so I have a whole pile of strips to add to my strip bucket. Luckily, I could put them straight in a project bag for something that I'm already working on. Not only have I moved my strips into a smaller bin, I now even have room in that bin to add more strips if I want to. But for now, it's time for the next project. We hope you remember to give us a thumbs up if you like the video, share with your quilting friends, leave us a comment, let us know what you think, and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and happy quilting!